Welcome back. We're still at the final day of our Breaking Barriers conference, and we're actually concluding reflections by the steering committee on the UDW program. The steering committee is responsible for all funding and strategic decisions within the Urbanizing Deltas of the World program. With me here in the studio is Isa Baud, chair of the UDW steering committee, and Maarten van Aalst, head of the International Red Cross Climate Center and member of the UDW steering committee. Both of you, good to have you here. Maarten, you're really involved in the international debates on climate change. You're a member of the UDW steering committee as well as the NWO-VOTRO steering committee. What do you think Dutch science means within the international context of climate change and achieving SDGs?
Well, I think the first thing to notice is that climate change is now one of those sort of global top topics, right? It's discussed by heads of state. It is very interwoven with development.
Yeah.
And also not the classical development. I think there were several references already about sort of the North sort of providing aid to the South. It is a very systemic issue that has a lot of elements of inequality with it, including the fact that we have contributed more to the problem that others in the South are suffering more from. Also that we have unequal access to solutions. So there is also a shared burden to contribute to the solutions. And that's, I think, where the question of science then comes in, right? It is something that is where the future is different from the past, but also the sorts of solutions that we need are different from the past.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's where I think as a Dutch community, a player in the world, our Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, speaking in Glasgow about implementation, that needs to be informed. And that is not just informed by a technological solution, 10 centimeters of sea level rise, we can calculate that, 10 centimeters on a seawall, and we're back to the same level of safety. These are systemic issues that we deal with here in the Netherlands, that countries that we've worked with in UDW deal with in their own deltas, but where we're also connected and where we can learn from each other. And I mean, one thing, I'm sure this has been in people's mind also as we were discussing these days, a country like Germany, with the recent flooding, with 200 people killed, has a lot to learn from a country like Bangladesh,
yes,
with only 124 people killed in a storm last year that would have killed hundreds of thousands of people in the 1970s.
And still, many people in Bangladesh feel or are being told off by us. So what are your thoughts about how we can get that self-reflection and implement it into policy, but also in our relationships with private sector, in the words that the Prime Minister says? Because you're in the debates, you actually can feel and hear what people in the South are saying with regards to the way we look at them and speak to them.
Well, I think the first is they want to be recognized for the concerns they have. They want to sense our acknowledgement of a shared burden for that, but then also they want to be recognized as part of the solution themselves rather than helpless victims.
Yeah.
So I think lots of the discussions here already about shaking the tree, but also the partnerships, the genuine collaboration, being better listeners, I think is part of that. At the same time, they recognize that it's not something they can do entirely on their own. And the not on their own is not just a matter of funding and us providing the resources there, but it's also the ways of working and recognizing that we have shared global challenges that we can work on together. And when we're working on a basis of sort of being equals there, but at the same time recognizing that we have a lot to share, from the Dutch knowledge sector in particular, there is so much here that we've learned about how to manage our delta in a technological sense, but also in an organizational sense. If we are good listeners about where we can contribute to their solutions, there is so much to give.
And I'd like to add that Salim ul Hook said that outsiders doesn't only mean the West, it's also outsiders within Bangladesh who come from government or army, or so outsiders outside of the village. It's not necessarily always a north-south issue.
And we're facing some of the same questions, right? I mean, in Bangladesh, the question is also within Bangladesh, who are most vulnerable and how are they being supported?
Exactly.
I think in the Netherlands with COVID, we faced similar issues. Undocumented migrants in the Netherlands, are they captured by our social security systems here? And these are the sort of systemic questions that are also part of what we're dealing with as a world right now.
What role and what could or should be done to support and strengthen the role of Dutch, but also science in a broader sense in these fields? Because it's about science. This Breaking Barriers is about science and policymakers, but science is a cornerstone. What should be done to enforce that?
Well, I think the recognition that science is critical is there. You know, the value of, for instance, the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in the discussions that we just had in Glasgow, but also the discussions that are now being had in the formation of our new government in the Netherlands, is undisputed. But in order to feed that sort of that knowledge base, you actually need to connect these really global, systemic, big challenges to really practical work in specific places, getting people together in the right networks. And I think that's what we've done in this program, UDW. So you also see some of that filtering up through these global processes, bringing that knowledge from what is actually happening in all these places and what needs to happen in many more places in a much more transformational way. And I think for the Dutch academic community, but also the Dutch companies doing regular business in agriculture or in other things, or bringing specific technological solutions like in the water sector, it's almost like this giant train that is going to shape global development for the coming decades has already left the station. So are we on it? Are we looking for these engagements, transforming the way we do our work by making these connections? Or are people in Bangladesh going to do it on their own, and then in a couple of decades we'll be standing on the sides?
Speaking of a train that has left the station, as chair of the UDW steering committee, you've been overseeing this process, and it's been a long 9 years with a lot of hard work. The train has left the station, I hope it has, but where it's going, you've seen a lot of the difficulties, the obstacles. Are you pleased with the results of all the hard work?
I'm not sure that pleased is the right word. What I have seen is what Maarten also said, is an enormous change from when we started out in this program. When we had, the projects were more individualized, they were more technology oriented. And what we've evolved to is projects which have, in the second phase, included the private sector much more. And in the third sector have focused much more on how the applicability of the different kinds of tools and instruments and approaches that have been developed in the first two phases of the program. And I think that's very important also in this discussion on how we work, say, between Dutch researchers or Dutch institutions, the institutions in the countries where work is being done, and how that kind of knowledge is also shared among a wider audience of interested research and policymakers and local communities. And I just want to mention two examples out of a whole range of examples which we have within the UDW program. And that is the Bangladesh Development Program, 2100, which focuses on the enormous systemic issues of the delta management and climate change together, and which involves policymakers, research institutions, private sector, technical people, and advocacy organizations, not only in Bangladesh, because it's a Bangladesh-led process, but it has involved Dutch researchers, the Dutch government, the World Bank, etc. So it's a multi-scalar and multi-stakeholder kind of program, but Bangladesh-led. And that really brings me to the fundamental change that has happened in the UDW program, namely the recognition that when we talk about the Dutch knowledge on delta management, yes, it's there, and we've developed it in our context. But if we wish it to make a contribution, an effective contribution elsewhere, it needs to be based on a two-way learning process between the institutions and the people who are knowledgeable about what is happening in their context. Because the Bangladesh Delta is vastly larger than the Dutch Delta, just to mention one. But so we have to have that kind of two-way conversation, three-way, four-way conversation, and recognize that the knowledge that we need for such systemic change is socially constructed, and socially constructed by a number of stakeholders and partners. Each has their role to play. But as someone was saying today, it's a two-way process of listening and learning and contributing, and that is really essential. It happened, and that's really something for the UDW program. It didn't happen only in Bangladesh, where a large part of our projects were based, but also in the Mekong Delta, because Vietnam was doing exactly the same, having a national Mekong Delta development policy, developing it and starting to implement that. And a number of the UDW projects were involved in that, as was our embassy. And the only way to really make these kind of policy processes and implementation processes, as Gabriele Bammer says, effective and feasible, is to have that exchange and learning going on. Across the generations, young researchers making very striking discoveries, like the discovery on subsidence, the importance of subsidence in the Mekong Delta, but also the senior researchers who have the access to policymakers and can provide that access to the younger researchers so that the exchange and the dialogues can go on. It's just it's a selection that I've mentioned now of what has gone on in UDW, because there is so much more.
But it's so interesting, because, and I've said it, but socially constructed, two-way learning process, sharing with a wider audience, Bangladeshi. It seems as if these are also things that have to do with the way we have been operating towards the South or towards other people in projects. That's an internal process at the institutions, but it also has to deal with how we can move forward in the future as a world together at the same time. What should we do? What do we absolutely need to do to head towards a better future? What?
Okay. I think a number of issues were already mentioned. One is longer term